Welcome! In this series of videos, we will cover the design and implementation of a project, from initial design through coding and development to testing, using the PowerBasic Windows compiler. Today we will continue our project to look at the use of software autoforms by adding tick boxes to the controls available. In the previous videos in this series, we have created two applications. The first application has its task of displaying to the user a list of configuration files. As you can see on screen here, we have a first and second form on the screen. Each of these configuration files has within it a list of objects, for example buttons, labels, text boxes, drop-down lists, etc. The definition of all these objects is used to dynamically build a dialog using our second application. If we click on the Run Form button, the second application runs. This reads the configuration file and displays the form layout to the user. This application is completely generic, driven entirely by its configuration file. As we can see here, we have a number of data forms which a user has filled in. We can display the data that's held in all the forms in a grid format. This allows you to create a new dialog without having to do any coding at all. You merely have to create a new configuration file. So what we're going to do today is to add a new object to the list of objects you can configure in these files. We're going to create a tick box or checkbox object. So let's have a look at the code. If we wish to amend the autoforms application to add support for a new type of object on the dialog, there are a number of functions that will need to be updated. So I'm going to list at the beginning of this code the functions that we will need to update. So in this way, if you need to add any more controls yourself to this application, you know which functions need to be amended. So here is the list of the 5 functions we're going to amend: fill form with record, get form data, populate form, reset form, and validate form. We're going to step through each of these functions one by one, adding in support for our checkboxes or tick boxes. So before we start amending the code, let's amend the configuration file. We're going to amend the test demo CSV file. If we open this in Notepad, we're going to add 2 entries to the bottom of this list. On this dialog, we'll want 2 new objects, a label and our tick box. Since we want the label to turn red if it's a mandatory field, then we want to keep this separate from the label on the tick box. So we will add first of all our label. This will be supported because we've done other labels before. Our label in this case is going to have the words full-time staff and a question mark. We're then setting the X and Y coordinates to position it on the dialog, 20 by 160. We're setting the width and the height to be 50 by 10. Additionally, we're setting the ID number as 2012, making it unique from all the other objects. Next, we want to add our tick box. This is an object we have not yet supported within our application. So its object name, in this case tick box, has to be unique. We're setting its location on screen, 75 by 157, its width and height by 15 by 15. Again, its ID needs to be unique, so we're setting that as 2013. As this is one of the fields we want to export to our output CSV file, we're calling that column full-time. And at the end, we're putting a tooltip. Tick to record as full-time staff. As you will see in the middle of this, I've got a pipe character. This pipe character is used to fold the tooltip in half. Basically, a carriage return line feed within the tooltip. So if we save this, and if we try running the application now, we will see the full-time staff question mark label appears on screen. This is because labels are already supported. But the tick box entry has done nothing to our dialog because we do not currently support tick boxes. So now we have to go into these functions and make amendments. So let's look at the first function, fill form with record. As you will see in here, there is a section of this function in which we look at the objects, be they text, drop-down lists, list boxes. And we'll need to add a new entry to the end of this to handle tick boxes. For this particular scenario, we're going to have a tick box having two values, either ticked or unticked. So we're going to set the value of the ticked one as 1 and the value of the unticked as 0. As the value variable already holds that value, we merely have to test it. So if the value within this variable is a string holding the value 1, we can then set the checkbox to the value ticked using the control set check command. If it is anything other than 1, then we'll set it as 0, which is unticked. So now we will tackle our second function, the getFormData. As before, the object is tested and we're doing conditional work depending on the type of object. And we will add to the end of this list another case statement to handle tick boxes. So we can use the control get check command to pick up the value in our control, using the global handle for the dialog and the handle for the control as we have done previously. We'll pass this to a new variable called longData. And we will set strdata to be equal to the string version of that variable. So we'll need to declare longData at the beginning of our function. And with that change in place, we can now move on to the next function. That would be populateForm. This function is the one that actually draws the control on the dialog. And as you will see, there are a series of case statements handling each of the different types of object. So we're adding a new one for tick boxes. So our first task is to set the style and the extended style. In this case, I'm just setting these to be the standard defaults for the tick box or checkbox. And as we've done before, we need to do a control add statement to add our new checkbox to the dialog. And of the parameters we need to supply will be the X and Y coordinates of it on the dialog, the width and height of the object, and the variables that hold the style values, just as we've done before for the other types of object. Now that we've handled that function, we move on to the resetForm function that blanks out all the data on the form. Again, this is another series of case statements, and we merely have to add a new case statement for our tick box. And we're using the control set check command to set the value of that particular tick box to not ticked. And on to our final function, the one that's used to validate data on the form. And again, there's another series of case statements. The validateForm function is designed to check to see if any of the objects are set as mandatory in your configuration file. If an object is mandatory and it has not been selected, then the application will not allow the user to proceed and will display an error message on screen, highlighting in red the label for that object. So for the tick boxes, we're getting the value in the checkbox by using the control get check command. If that value is 0, then strdata is blank. Otherwise, we're marking strdata as number 1. And further down in the function is the code that will return the field value and display the message to the user that a mandatory field has not been selected. So as we're using longData again, we'll need to declare this at the beginning of our function. Like so. So now that we've made all the changes to these functions, have we done enough to allow the application to support tick boxes? Let's try running the application and see. Well, we now have two new objects on our screen, a label saying full-time staff and a tick box ready to be ticked. So let's go back to the beginning of our forms and tick the first one. And if we hit the OK button, and it's telling us the form has been saved. So if we have a look at the grid, we'll see we now have a full-time column, but we have not yet got any values within it. So there's more to be done to populate this last column. So let us have a look at the code that populates this grid. In the function that displays this grid to the user on a dialog are a number of key pieces of code. One of the things this will do is to read the headers in the output file. So at the moment, the headers in our output file are incomplete. If we have a look at the user data CSV, it at the moment does not have the full-time column. So if we open that up in Notepad and we add on the new column and save that. If we try running our application again now and have a look at the grid dialog, we'll see we now have a value in the full-time column for our first form. As we designated the value 1 for ticked and 0 for unticked, this is showing a 1. If we go to our second form and we save it once more and have a look at our grid, we'll see the value is showing as 0. The rest are blank because we have not yet resaved those forms. While this is useful to see a 1 or a 0 for a ticked or unticked, it would be really much more aesthetically pleasing to have an actual tick box in the full-time column. However, my little grid, which we're currently using, can define one of these columns as being a checkbox column, so it will be displayed as a checkbox with either a tick or no tick in the box. So how can we configure our setup to display this column as a checkbox column? Let's have a look back at the code. In our function that displays this grid dialog to the user, we'll need to call a new function in here. We want to designate any of the columns which are defined as tick boxes to display as tick boxes on the grid control. So we're going to create a new function to do that. And we're going to slot this new function in after the setColumnNames function. Like that function, our new function, setGridTickBoxes, is going to take two parameters. First is the handle of the grid, and the second is the list of headers that appear at the top of our grid. So let's go ahead and create this new function. So here is the skeleton of our function with its two parameters, the grid handle and the string of column headers. I've created a number of local variables to be used within this function. We're going to be looking at the configuration file. The configuration file will define which of the objects on the dialog is a tick box, so we need to look at the object column to see any of those which are marked as tick boxes. The column headers define the name of the fields as they're going to be on our grid. This appears in the field name column. So we need to look at each record which has something in the field name column to see if any of them have tick box in the object column. So our first task is to get the column number for each of these columns. So we're populating the field name column variable using the parseFind function, which is one of the functions in our libraries. This takes the standard headers and is looking for the field name column. And we're doing exactly the same for the object. This will return the column numbers of both of these fields. Next, we'll need to use a for next loop to step through our variable column headers. This is a comma-delimited list of headers. So we use the parseCount command to count how many of these headers there actually are. And we're picking up the header name for that column using the parse command. So now that we've got the header name, we need to step through each record in the config array. So another for next loop. And within this for next loop, we can do a test. We're looking for the value in the field name column to see if it matches our header. If this does match, then we have found the field we're looking for. But is it a tick box? So now we will check the object column. And if the object column is tick box, then we have found a field which is indeed a tick box, and we need to configure the grid to tell it that. We can use one of the inbuilt commands to MyLittleGrid to format a column as a checkbox in a single line of code. And that function is mlg format call check. It takes two parameters, the grid handle and the column which we want to turn into a checkbox. As each entry in the config array is unique, then we need not look through the rest of the array. We can then move on to the next header. And we can do that quite easily by using the iterate for command. this will skip forward to look for the next for loop. And if we discover that the field name is not a tick box, then we can use just iterate for. So this function should be enough to designate the columns which are tick boxes as tick boxes within the grid. So we try running the application now. And if we click on our icon to view all the forms in the grid, we can now see the full-time column is appearing as a tick box. Both forms 1 and forms 2 are showing as being ticked. However, if we look at form 1 is ticked, and form 2 is not ticked. So there's obviously some additional change we have to make sure that the value going in to the grid is correctly interpreted. So let's look back at the code to see what else we need to do. The reason my little grid is displaying both ticked and unticked checkboxes as ticked in the grid is the way the data is held within my little grid. Its definition of a ticked checkbox is if the value is something other than an empty len string. An empty len string is unticked and anything else is ticked. So we have to make a minor modification to our code. If we go to the getFormData function, which pulls the information off the form the user has filled in and saves it in the array. Currently for the tick box, we're just picking up str data as the value that's coming out of the control. If we replace that with a test to see if the data equals 1, then str data equals 1. Otherwise, it's going to be an empty len string. If we try running that code now, and go back to our first form, we will see that the first form is ticked. The second form is not ticked. So if we have a look at the My Little Grid, we'll see the first form is ticked and the second one now is not ticked. So if we go into form number 3 and tick that one and click the save, go back to the grid, we'll see that now 1 and 3 are now successfully ticked. So in summary, what we've achieved today is we've added a new type of object to the objects which can exist on our dynamically configured dialog. This is a checkbox or tick box. As with all other objects, we can define where it is located on the screen. We can also display it as a tick box on our My Little Grid dialog, which displays all the forms on one page. So now we have a good selection of objects that can appear on your configurable forms, all without you having to write a single line of code. Hopefully you'll find this useful in your applications, but that's it for today. Thank you for watching.